When the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z/28 first appeared, most people didn't immediately understand what they were looking at. It didn't scream for attention the way American performance cars usually did. It didn't have a massive big block under the hood, it didn't boast outrageous horsepower numbers, and it didn't wear the kind of visual aggression that made teenagers stop and stare. To anyone who wasn't paying attention, it almost looked like Chevy had made a quieter Camaro that year, not a sharper one. But that misunderstanding is exactly why the Z/28 became so intriguing. It wasn't built for the usual crowd. It wasn't made to win drag races on Saturday nights or to dominate stoplight sprints. It was built for something totally different, to attack road courses, to outmaneuver the Mustangs. Ford was pushing into SCCA Trans Am racing, and to win within a rulebook that seemed designed to make domination impossible. The Z/28 didn't care. It wasn't created for hype. It was created to solve a problem. And the engineers behind it were thinking very differently from most American car teams of the late 60s. While everyone else was chasing cubic inches, building bigger, heavier, louder engines, Chevrolet decided to go surgical. Instead of brute force, they wanted precision. Instead of torque, they wanted response. Instead of marketing bragging rights, they wanted lap times. That's why the Z/28 came with the high-winding 302 cubic inch small block, a strange displacement that seemed almost random unless you knew the Trans Am rules. To compete, engines had to stay under 5 liters. So Chevy did something brilliant. They took a 327 block, combined it with the shorter stroke crank from a 283, and created an engine that revved like it belonged in a European race car instead of an American pony car. At idle, it sounded normal, almost tame. But once the tach swept past 4,000, the entire personality of the car changed. The engine started to pull with an intensity that kept building all the way past 7,000 RPM, sometimes more, depending on how brave the driver was feeling. It didn't throw you back in your seat with low-end force. It climbed into power like a machine that wanted to meet the red line every single time you touched the throttle. But the brilliance of the Z/28 goes deeper than the engine itself. Everything around it was tailored to transform the Camaro into something that didn't behave like the typical muscle cars Chevrolet was known for. The suspension wasn't soft and forgiving. It was firm, responsive, designed to communicate with the driver. The brakes weren't an afterthought. They were essential because Trans Am racing demanded that you slow down as confidently as you could accelerate. The steering wasn't vague or lazy. It was quick, twitchy even, because the car needed to change direction instantly to stay competitive against the Boss 302. And Chevy didn't pair the 302 with a sloppy automatic. They gave it a close ratio Muncie 4-speed that forced the driver to work, to think, to stay engaged, to keep the engine in its razor-sharp power band. The Z/28 didn't tolerate laziness. It wasn't a car for casual drivers. It was a car for people who wanted to fight on a track. And yet, to the average buyer, none of this was obvious. The Z/28's personality was hidden beneath a design that, at first glance, didn't look much different from a standard '69 Camaro. Its stripes weren't cosmetic. They were homologation signatures, proof that this car existed for racing first and sales second. But many people didn't even know that. They just saw another Camaro and assumed it was a slightly sportier version of the SS or RS. They didn't realize that the 302 under the hood wasn't a compromise. It was a weapon engineered to destroy Ford in a very specific war. They didn't realize that the Z/28 wasn't trying to beat anyone in a straight line. It wanted to beat them everywhere else. And while other cars bragged with noise and visual flair, the Z/28 did something far more intimidating. It kept quiet and let the stopwatch do the talking. And that's really where the intrigue begins. Because the more you learn about the Z/28, the more you realize how much of its greatness is invisible to anyone who isn't paying attention. Chevy built it to be underestimated. They built it to look like a Camaro that should lose, not one that would win. It was designed to lull you into thinking it was slower, softer, less serious than its competition, right up until the moment it passed you in a corner with an engine screaming towards 7 grand and a chassis that felt like it was glued to the road. The Z/28 didn't care about muscle car traditions. It didn't care about big block superiority complexes. It didn't care about looking impressive sitting still. It cared about one thing: winning Trans Am. And once you finally see the Z/28 through the lens of what it was built to do, the rest of its story becomes even more fascinating, because the moment this car was put into real competition, everything Chevy had intended became obvious to anyone watching. On paper, the 302 didn't look impressive in a world where big blocks were dominating sales. But on the track, where power-to-weight ratios, response, and handling trumped raw cubic inches, the Z28 came alive in a way that left people stunned. It wasn't the fastest car in a straight line. In fact, a well-driven big block Camaro or a Mopar would walk away from it in a drag race. But the Z28 didn't care about straight lines. It cared about corner exits, braking points, mid-corner balance, and the ability to sit at high RPM for lap after lap without giving up. And that was where it destroyed expectations. The 302 small block was practically begging to be pushed. Drivers who were used to big block torque had to relearn their instincts. Instead of shifting early, they had to let the tach sweep past 6,000 and climb until the engine sounded like it was hovering on the edge of detonation. But that sound, that high-rev scream, was exactly what gave the Z/28 its identity. As the revs climbed, something clicked in the car. It felt lighter, sharper, hungrier. The power band wasn't a curve. It was a cliff, and once you stepped onto it, the Z28 behaved like a completely different animal. Keep the engine in that zone and suddenly Mustangs that seemed dangerous in a straight line looked helpless in the corners. The Z/28 didn't win by brute strength. It won by momentum, by refusing to slow down, by being designed to carry speed where others had to lift. And the rest of the car rose to meet that engine. The suspension tuning was firm, with a responsiveness that made the Z28 feel almost nervous at low speeds but absolutely stable at high speeds. The quick ratio steering meant you couldn't be lazy. Every small movement had a consequence. The brakes, especially when equipped with the optional front discs, gave the driver confidence to dive deeper into corners. And the Muncie close ratio 4-speed kept the gears packed tight, letting the engine stay exactly where it wanted to be. Nothing about the Z/28 felt accidental. Every component existed because Chevy knew exactly what they needed to win the Trans Am war. And that war reached its peak in 1969, when the Z/28 found itself face-to-face with Ford's boss, 302, a rival so evenly matched that the two cars created one of the greatest performance duels in American racing history. The boss had its own high-revving small block, its own rigid chassis, its own confidence in corners. It was the perfect opponent. And watching the two cars fight on track was like watching two predators that had evolved for the same environment. The Z/28 wasn't defeating the boss through overwhelming superiority. It was matching it blow for blow. But that's exactly what made the '69 Z28 so special. Chevy had created a car capable of going toe-to-toe with the best Ford had ever engineered without relying on gimmicks or shortcuts. It was pure, honest mechanical performance. But out on the street, the Z28 lived a double life. Most average buyers didn't understand it at all. They drove it like a big block and thought it felt weak. They shifted at 3,000 RPM and assumed Chevy had built a slower Camaro. Some dealerships struggled to explain that the Z28 wasn't meant for casual cruising, and that the engine they were complaining about was actually a hand-built, race-bred power plant designed to be thrashed. More than a few buyers traded them back in because they didn't feel fast. But enthusiasts, the ones who knew how to listen to an engine rather than judge it by idle, those people understood immediately. They took the Z/28 to back roads, kept the tatch needle near redline, and realized they were driving something completely different from the muscle cars that filled parking lots. The Z/28 didn't reveal its personality to just anyone. It demanded skill. And that's part of why the Z/28 became so mythic in the decades that followed. It wasn't built to please consumers. It wasn't built to win showroom popularity contests. It was built the way a weapon is built, with intent, with rules in mind, with an understanding of the battlefield. And because so many buyers misunderstood it, far fewer Z28s were abused, wrecked, or transformed into drag racers compared to other Camaros of the era. Many survived in their pure form, and collectors later realized just how rare it was to find a machine that looked like a muscle car but behaved like a road racing prototype. Today, the 1969 Z/28 sits in that rare category of cars that were almost invisible to the wrong audience when new, but became priceless to the right audience later on. It represents the moment Chevrolet proved they didn't need cubic inches to build something competitive. They needed engineering. It represents the moment the Camaro became more than a Mustang rival. It became a platform capable of precision. And it represents the final evolution of the first-generation Camaro, sharpened to its absolute limit, refined into something that barely resembles the simple pony car Chevy introduced in 1967. And maybe that's the real legacy of the 69 Z28. It wasn't the loudest or the flashiest or the most powerful. It was the most focused, the most intentional, the most deceptively dangerous. A car that hid its strength behind a modest displacement number and then revealed it only to the drivers who knew how to unlock it. A car that proved victory doesn't always belong to the biggest engine or the heaviest punch. Sometimes it belongs to the machine designed with the clearest purpose.